All right, guys, we're going to go on and start going over the review sheet. Now, looks like someone took one, lost it, and then took a second. Error. What's that called? Entitled 201106. So it should be there by the time you get there.
So I opened up the crunch bar and I went to go put it in my mouth. It was like the little one. I don't know where it went. It disappeared. I can't. I should have fucking no, like the wrap was my other hand. So I don't know where it went.
So problems 1 through 12, we're going to factor the following polynomials. So when we factor a quadratic, we do several main steps. The first step is the greatest common factor. We see if there is a number that can go into all three terms. And for this first one here, the number is 7. So we'll factor it out of each term. And if we factor 7 out of 7b squared, we're left with b squared minus. If we factor 7 out of 63, we're left with 9b plus. If we factor 7 out of 140, we're left with 20. Because we're pulling 7 out of each one, we're dividing each term by 7, giving us 7 times b squared minus 9b plus 20. Once we've done that, we move on to step 2, our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces, giving us enough room to put everything we need. Questions on steps 1 and 2. Step number 3 is define the signs. And to find the sign, we look at the third term. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, the signs are opposite. So here the sign of the third term is positive. So the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term, which is negative. So they're both negative. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third terms. Well, the factors of b squared, there's only one set. It is b and b. So those are the only factors of b squared. Now the factors of 20, we'll write them out. 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. Then at this point here, we just need to pick one of the factors of b. Stapler's right there. 4 and 5. So I'm just going to plug them in. And the last thing we need to do is to check and make sure we got the correct factors. Now again, I don't multiply everything through. Partially because, well, we don't necessarily have to multiply b and b because we got that from b squared. They're the factors of b squared, so they should get back to b squared. 4 and 5, we got it from the factors of 20, so they're going to multiply together to give us 20. We don't necessarily have to multiply those back. The main one we need to make sure we get is the middle term, our negative 9b. So b times negative 5 is negative 5b. Negative 4 times b is negative 4b. And negative 5b minus 4b is negative 9b. Is that the middle term we wanted? So that's it there. Questions on this here? Bless you. Questions on number 2? Questions on 1 or 2? We're good with problems 1 and 2. Questions on 3 or 4? Which one do we want to look at? 4. So with factoring, again, the first thing we want to look for is a greatest common factor. Is there a number or term that can go into all 3? No. So we move on to step number 2. Our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Okay, well, that takes care of steps 1 and 2. Step 3, find the signs. If the third term is positive, then the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, the signs are opposite. So here, the third term is? So it's positive, yes? Third term's positive? So the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, our third term in this case is 1, then the signs would be opposite. Here it is positive, so the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term, which is negative. So we have negative and negative. Our third term is going to be our constant term, term without a variable. Questions on this so far? Factors of the first term, factors of the first and third term now. So 6x squared, well, we will have x and x. And that's the only way we get x squared. Now the factors of 6 are 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. Which one do we want to try first? 2 and 3. So we'll have 2x and 3x. Now where we put the 2 and 3 isn't as important right now because we will check it later, but we do plug those in. Factors of 1 are 1 and 1. Since we only have one setup, we can just plug it in. And the last step is to check and make sure we got this set up correctly. 2x times negative 1 is negative 2x. Negative 1 times 3x is negative 3x. Negative 2x minus 3x is negative 5x. Is that the middle term we wanted? So those are the factors of 6x squared minus 5x plus 1. Questions on any of this here? Questions on 5 and 6? 6, is there a greatest common factor between the 3 terms? No, but we can factor one thing out. The negative. Because if the first term is negative and we're factoring, it's going to make everything a lot nicer if we factor that negative out. Questions on this here? No? Lost? Okay. So with factoring, we're going through some few basic steps. The first one's to get rid of any common factors. That's going to make them easier to work with. Make them a little bit easier, smaller numbers. I find it better to have that first term, that value of a, to be positive, so we're not looking at those different terms. Looking at 3 factors of negative 3. 1 and negative 3, 3 and negative 1. So we pull that negative out. And it gets us to this point here. Second steps are 2 sets of parentheses, because that's how we need it to factor. We will keep the greatest common factor of that negative there. And we have our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. 3 spaces is just giving us room to put stuff down. Finding the signs. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. Well, the way we get the third term is these two being multiplied together. Well, if both of those are negative, negative times a negative is a positive. If they're both positive, a positive times a positive is a positive. The only way that the signs can be the same is if that last term is positive. If the signs are opposite, one positive, one negative, negative times a positive is a negative. So it kind of gives us a hint at what it is. Now for this here, since the third term is positive, the signs are the same, and they're always going to match whatever the middle term is. Now the last few have been negative. If it had been plus 11 and we had plus 6, they would both be plus. Here they're both going to be negative, so negative and negative. Questions on this here? Not so far. Now we're going to find the factors of the first and third terms. Factors of 3t squared. Well, t squared, just t and t, because that's the only way we can multiply two things together and get t squared. Factors of 3 are 1 and 3. We only have one setup, so we can just plug it in. Now, how we plug it in, which one gets the 3, which one gets the 1, at this point doesn't really matter, because our final step is to check. We're going to check and make sure we got it right. So if it's not, then we can make adjustments from there. Now the other one is the factors of 6. Well, 6 has two sets of factors, 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. 2 and 3, which one's going where? 2 and then 3. Now the last thing we need to do is to check, and we're trying to see if we get negative 11t. I don't check 3t and t, because we got 3t and t from 3t squared. They're going to multiply back together to be that. So there's not a whole lot of reason to check it. We can if we want, don't have to. Same is true with 6. Negative 2 times negative 3 is still positive 6. We got it from those factors. So we don't have to check those because it's not going to change. The only one that does is these here when we check our middle term. 3t times negative 3 is negative 9t. Negative 2 times t is negative 2t. And this gives us negative, not 7, negative 11t. Is that what we wanted? Yeah. Because the very top one is positive, but we pulled that negative out. So it did change it from positive to negative. Questions on this here? Any questions on any of this so far? We good? Question on 7 or 8? 7. So if we look at this one here, there isn't a greatest common factor between the three terms. But because this first term is negative, I'm going to factor the negative out. We're essentially dividing everything by negative 1, and it's making all the terms go from positive to negative or negative to positive. Once we factor that out, 2 parentheses with 3 spaces. Okay, find the signs. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, the signs are opposite. Here, the third term is negative. So one of them will be, and the other is negative. Now, it really doesn't matter at this point which one we set is plus, which one is minus, because step number 5 is to check. So if we do have it in the wrong setup, we can fix it after we check. That's why the check step is so nice. Now, factors of the first and third terms. 4c squared, well, there's only one setup for c squared. It's c and c. Factors of 4, there are more than one. 1 and 4 or 2 and 2. Which one do we want to try first? 1 and 4. Where do we want to put the 4? Now, factors of 5. 1 and 5. Are there any others? No. So I'm just going to throw them in. Because the last step is to check. C times 4c is still 4c squared. 1 times negative 5 is still negative 5. Those didn't change. C times negative 5 is negative 5c. 1 times 4c is plus 4c, giving us negative c. Is that the middle term we wanted? No, we need negative 19. Well, one of the things I can switch is the 1 and 5. We could have also switched the 4c and c. Flip those, either one would work. Let's check this again. C times negative 1 is negative c. 5 times 4c is plus 20c, giving us 19c. Is that what we wanted? We're close, aren't we? Yes. Because if we get the correct number but wrong sign, change the signs. Because if we look at this here again, c times 1 okay, that is c times 1 is positive 1c. Negative 5 times 4c is minus 20c, which is negative 19c, which is now what we want. So this is it here. Questions on this here? Questions on number 8? I think this is still part of factoring. Also, one of the other big indicators if we're solving is it's equal to something.
I didn't know what to do.
4n squared is 4 a perfect square. What times itself is 4? What times itself is 49? 7. So is 4n squared a perfect square? Yeah, 2n times 2n is 4n squared, yes? Is 49 a perfect square? Yeah. And what are we doing? We're subtracting. We have a difference of perfect squares. And it works out the difference of perfect squares. A squared minus b squared is equal to a plus b times a minus b. Because what we're saying is that 2n squared minus 7 squared is the same thing. And if we're following this pattern here, a is 2n. So we'd have 2n and 2n. b is 7. And the signs would be opposite. And that's actually it. 2n plus 7 and 2n minus 7. And even if we went through our steps of factoring, it still works the same. It's just our third term is now negative 49 because the middle term is 0, 0n. And if we wanted to check and make sure we got this right, 2n times 7 is 14n. Negative 7 times 2n is negative 14n. And 14n minus 14n is 0. So our middle term simplifies out. Questions on this here? Let's look at number 9. 169x squared minus 144. Is 169 a perfect square? What would it be? So 14 and 14. And x squared is x squared. What times itself is 144 is 12. So our a squared minus b squared is equal to a plus b times a minus b. Well, our a in this case is 14x. Our b is 12. So I can say 14x plus 12 and 14x minus 12. It's recognizing a different type of touch. Because it can do two gestures, fine point and thicker point. But it's a little sensitive. Now, one thing that is interesting with this one here, if we look at both terms, 14 and 12, do they have a greatest common factor? If I factor it out, 2 out of 14x would be 7x. 2 out of 12 would give us 6. But I can also factor it out of the other one. Well, 2 times 2 is 4. I will take this or this. I will take either one. On the ACT, if it does ask you to factor 196x squared minus 144 completely, it's looking for the bottom one. Because since we factored a 2 out of both, those two factors of 2 are out front. And our 2 times 2 gives us 4. Now, if we notice, well, 196 and 144 are both divisible by 4. 196 divided by 4 is 49. 144 divided by 4 is 36. So if we factor it out, we get 49x squared minus 36. Well, what times itself is 49? Then we will have our x. What times itself is 36? Still works the same. So if we notice the greatest common factor of 4 first, we could factor it out and then do the same steps. Friday. Questions on number 10? Okay, what times itself is a squared? Well, that'd be a and a. What times itself is 25b squared? Well, 5 and b. That's it. Factoring, if we have 2 terms being subtracted, is going to be a difference of perfect squares. Questions on any of this here? 11 and 12 are going to be our same factoring methods. Questions on 11 and 12? Is there a greatest common factor? No. So, 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Since the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So we'll have negative and negative. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. Factors of a squared are and a. Factors of 196. 1 and 98. 3 doesn't work. 4 and what? 49. Which one do we want to try first? Yes. 14 and 14. A times negative 14 is negative 14a. Negative 14 times a is negative 14a, which is negative 28a. Now there is another way we could write this because we have a minus 14 times a minus 14, which is the same as a minus 14 squared. I'll take either version. Because they are the same answer. Questions on this here? Almost. Because it's not a minus 14. They'd both be positive, and it'd be x plus 12 squared. (13 through 16). Which one do we want to look at?
Let's go
15. 1089 squared minus 961 squared. I hope no one gets any of these wrong on the test.
Doing the calculator.
You're about 3 zeros off. Okay. Yeah. Enter in the calculator. I really hope y'all don't get these wrong. Because again, I put a note somewhere, we're just plugging these in and letting the calculator do it for us. So the one that we did, we got 262,400. Any other questions on 13 through 16? Now the next set is to solve these by any method. The first method we saw for solving quadratics was factoring. Our second method that we had was graphing. Third method was the square root method. Now these work some of the times, they did not work every time. The first method that worked every time was completing the square. And the last method that we had was the quadratic formula. So we had any of these 5 methods to solve. Now if we look at the first one here, we can do number 17, x squared plus 3x plus 2. So if we want to solve it by any method, one way we could do is graph it. So we can say x squared plus 3x plus 2, graph. We can type it into the graphing calculator and say graph. And whenever we graph it, we're looking for where it crosses the x-axis. We want to see what values of x make the y value be 0. That's it. Because it said by any method, we use graphing, and we were able to solve. We can look at the next one. 0 equals x squared minus 9. We can solve this by the square root method. The reason we know we can use the square root method is because we do not have a middle term. We do not have x by itself. We have an x squared, but we don't have x. So the first step in the square root method is to get the term being squared by itself. And we can do that by adding 9 to both sides, which will tell us that x squared is equal to 9. At this point here, we take the square root of both sides, telling us x is equal to plus or minus, because anytime we take the square root of both sides, we need to add the plus or minus. And the square root of 9 is 3. So x is equal to positive or negative 3. That was square root method. If we graphed it, we do see it crosses the x-axis in 2 places. One of them is negative 3, the other is 3. X is equal to positive or negative 3, plus or minus 3. Questions on how we solved either one of these here? Questions on 19 or 20? 20. So one thing we could try doing is I could try getting this equal to 0. We can subtract 10 from both sides. 4 times x minus 1 squared minus 8 equals 0. 4 parentheses x minus 1 squared minus 8. Graph. We do have this here, but if we notice, it crosses at two spots that are not nice because it's not an integer. So there's a good chance we're going to need to actually solve this. Now we could solve it by the square or quadratic formula, but we have to get the x minus 1 squared simplified. We could do it by completing the square, but we have the same issue. However, the only place where there's an x is inside the parentheses being squared. Let's get it by itself. So the first thing I can do is add 8 to both sides, which will tell us that 4 x minus 1 squared is equal to is our set of parentheses being squared by itself.
Oh no, it's x minus 1.
The 4 is with it, yes? So is it by itself? No, we have to divide both sides by 4. Because again, we need, for the square root method, we need to get the term being squared by itself. Because we're not so much worried about what's inside. I'm more worried about the set of parentheses. Because the set of parentheses being squared, it's what's being squared. We need it by itself. So we had to move the 8 over by adding it. We had to move the 4 over by dividing it. Now is the set of parentheses by itself. Yeah. So that means we can take the square root of both sides. And here our square root and the square would cancel, telling us x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus. Whenever you take the square root of both sides, we have to add the plus or minus. And well, the square root of 2 is just square root of 2. It's an irrational number. It will not reduce. And the last thing we need to do is to solve for x. So this will tell us x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. That's why I didn't cross at a nice spot, because, well, that's an irrational number. Questions on any of this here? Questions on anything we've done so far? We ready for the next one? I'm going to jump over to 24. We'll get back to 23 in a minute because the pages are out of order. I do need to fix that. 24, it says solve each of the following, or solve each of the equation by using the completing the square method. There are a few problem sets on the first part of the test that do require a certain method for solving. If you get stuck and can't do those, solve it a different way, because you will lose the 1 or 2 points for solving it by the correct method, but you will still get the points for getting the correct answer. So here, if for some reason you get stuck with solving it by completing the square, but can get it by the quadratic formula, go on and get the correct answer. You'll only lose, I think it's 2 or 3 points for not doing the correct method. Quite a bit. Now, completing the square. First step, is a equal to 1? If not, make it so. So since a is 2, we divide everything by 2. So our 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared. Negative 12x divided by 2 is negative 6x. Negative 24 divided by 2 is negative 12. Well, that takes care of step 1. Step number 2, get the variables by themselves and leave 2 spaces. I need to add that and leave 2 spaces. We add 12 to both sides. because we want the x squared and negative 6x by itself. So we had x squared minus 6x plus blank is equal to 12 plus blank. Because what we're wanting to do in this process is to rewrite the quadratic as a set of parentheses squared. Now the next step is to find the value of c and plug it in. Well, the value of c is b over 2 squared. So the value we plug into both spots is c or b over 2 squared. I would write them all down. If there's anything that's going to help you do better on it, I would put the notes in the review sheet. You can use the review sheet on the test, but that's going to be it, besides the calculator, something to write with. So b is negative 6, and again, this is referring back to our ax squared plus bx plus c. Now our negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And negative 3 squared is 9. Questions on this here? Now, the whole goal was to rewrite this quadratic as a set of parentheses squared. Now we will have x, and the number that goes inside the parentheses will be whatever we had before we squared it, so negative 3. So we have x minus 3 squared. Our 12 plus 9 is 21. So, well, we got through step 3, find the factor of c. Find c and plug it in, we did that. Halfway through step 4, we factored it. Now we just need to solve. And to solve, we're going to take the square root of both sides. Square root of x minus 3 squared is going to be x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus square root of 21. Well, it's the square root of 21. If the radical can reduce, you need to reduce it. So if it was, say, square root of negative 21, the negative would come out as I. We'd have I squared to 21. But the last step, to get x by itself, we would add 3 to both sides. We put the 3 in front of the plus or minus, telling us that x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 21. And that's as far as it goes. Now, if we're able to add or subtract them, we need to add or subtract them. So if it had reduced to, say, just 21, and we had 3 plus or minus 21, we can add 3 and 21. We can subtract 3 and 21. We need to add and subtract. Here, they are not like terms, so that's as far as it goes. Questions on this here as I throw a marker? We good with this here? Okay. 23. This is the last one we're going to look at today. We will finish this tomorrow. There is at least one like this on the test. I did not put these on the review sheet because these here are solving by factoring. It is already factored, so we could go from there. But apparently, in years past, it turns out I need to put one of these on the review. Because when we factor something, we end up factoring the 2 sets of parentheses. Whenever we have 2 or more things multiplied together that equal 0, one of them must be what? 0. Solve. Add 7 to both sides, telling us 2x equals 7. Divide both sides by 2. The other one, we would subtract 13. telling us 5x equals negative 13. Divide by 5. I already factored it for you. Now you just have to solve it. And that's it for those. Because again, I put at least one of those on the test to kind of be nice. It's already factored. All you had to do was set each part equal to 0 and solve. Apparently it confused everybody. But any questions on any of this so far? Okay. I will